Hello, today we are doing chapter 5. So chapter 5 is on neurodevelopmental disorders. This is one of those chapters that has been changed a bit from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. I'll give you some updates as we go along. This is also one of those chapters that there are so many fantastic things out there on the internet as far as YouTube videos, other learning resource sites that do show videos of children who have these particular types of disorders. I will show you one short video when we get to talking about Rett syndrome. But if you're going into this field and you're wanting to work with children, then I think it's great to get a better idea of some of these issues and what do they actually look like in the real world. Okay, today we're going to talk about a lot of different things, including intellectual disabilities and ADHD and other things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. A neurodevelopmental disorder in general. Okay, these are disorders that begin early in life. Okay, they remain with that individual throughout the life. So these used to be called, our childhood disorders. They're now called neurodevelopmental disorders. Again, the idea is that this is something that's not going to change. We see these types of children or adults in therapeutic settings because we can use techniques to help the person live in society, make their lives a little bit easier. Okay, we want to help the parents, we want to help the children, and then as they become adults, but we don't actually make the disorder go away. All right. So the deficits within neurodevelopmental disorders are going to impair personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder. You can apparently call it either one. Before, and I'll come down to here where I'm talking here, is that this used to be called mental retardation. And up until just this current DSM, we called this mental retardation. When I was trained in this, we were trained to identify and diagnose mental retardation and how severe it was. Over time, that term has become used in a derogatory way. I mean, it simply means mental slowedness, if you will. But it's been used in such a negative way that they decided to change the terminology to intellectual disability. Okay? Again, if you work in this field, you may hear other people continue to call it mental retardation, and just know that that is the way that everybody before this very moment has been trained. Okay, so this diagnosis is used to characterize individuals who have intellectual and adaptive deficits. Okay, and they first become evident when they're children. So this is not somebody who has a brain injury and ends up having issues later. This is somebody who, from childhood, has had intellectual issues. These are characterized by deficits in general mental abilities, such as reasoning, problem solving, judgment, ability to learn from experience, and learning in an academic context. If we think about those things that we learned about when we talked about intelligence testing. Okay? Now, if you remember, the average intelligence score is 100, and the standard deviation is 15 from that. Now, we say that someone can technically be diagnosed with an intellectual disability if they have an IQ score of 70 or below. Okay, 70 or below. Somebody who meets right above 70, maybe within the 85 to 70 range, is going to be considered borderline intellectual functioning. And that's actually a diagnosis that we do use, is borderline intellectual functioning. But 70 or below, we are going to diagnose this person with an intellectual disability. Now, if you remember in the assessment section, I said you would never diagnose somebody just on one assessment, right? So we also need to look at the whole person. This disorder has to also involve impairment in adaptive functioning, and that is relative to a person's age, relative to their cultural group, and a variety of daily activities, right? So they must have impairment in communication, social participation, and independent living. So it's not just the score on the test, but it's also looking at these other things. So examples would be, difficulty using money, telling time, relating to other people in social settings. Okay. So within the intellectual developmental disorder, we do assign a degree of severity. We would say mild, moderate, severe, or profound. Again, when I was trained before the DSM-5, we based this mild, moderate, severe, profound solely on the IQ score. Now in the DSM-5, the levels of severity are based on how well the individual is able to adapt in conceptual, social, and practical domains. So it's not just the IQ score anymore. It's looking at their whole life and how are they functioning in society. Okay, so let's look at some causes of intellectual developmental disorders. Now, there are a lot. This is only a few. So we're going to talk about Down syndrome, we're going to talk about PKU, and we're going to talk about Fragile X syndrome. Again, there is a long list. We're just going to hit on these three today. So Down syndrome is caused by abnormal chromosomal formation during conception. Okay, and this is why we can test very early to find out if your pregnancy, if the child has Down syndrome or not. Okay, so you can have this type of testing while you're pregnant to find out. So what's actually happening here is that this person has an extra copy of chromosome 21. So they have 47 instead of 46 chromosomes. They have an extra chromosome. Sometimes this is also referred to as trisomy 21. So if you've ever heard people use that term, trisomy 21 is one kind of Down syndrome or one variation of Down syndrome. But the idea is this: it has typically extra chromosome 21. Now, when we see somebody with Down syndrome, that person typically has flattened nose, smaller ears, that upward slanting eyes. They tend to have smaller head circumference and slightly a different shape to their head than the average person. Okay, so what's interesting is we see the same thing happen in each scenario, and we see the same types of changes in appearance, phenotypes, if you will. And this happens across cultures, right? We see this in, all different races and cultures. Okay, PKU. PKU is one of the most interesting ones to me because we can reverse it. I said none of them can be reversed. I lied. Here's one that can, and that is if we catch PKU at an early age, and almost all babies, at least here in the US, are tested for it immediately. If they have this missing enzyme, then they can be put on a specific diet to basically make it go away. So children born with PKU are missing an enzyme that breaks down an amino acid that's found in foods that contain protein. So we find that if these children are placed on a diet low in phenylalanine early in life, then they do not develop intellectual disability. If they are not placed on this type of a diet, then they do develop intellectual disabilities. So basically, they need to avoid things that are high in proteins. So they avoid milk, they avoid eggs. And interesting, they also have to avoid aspartame, which is a fake sugar, right? It's a sugar substitute. So I always that it's an interesting one that they have figured out. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X syndrome is the most common form of intellectual disability in males, and it is mostly found in males, not solely, but mostly. It's caused by a change in the gene fMRI, not to be confused with the fMRI that we use to look at brains. This is a gene called the fMRI gene. There's a little bit of a change that happens there, and we see Fragile X syndrome. People with Fragile X syndrome also have very specific types of changes in facial structure. When it happens in women, we often see that these women have trouble conceiving. They have premature menopause. Some men and women are sterile with this type of an issue. Every once in a while, someone's not. And with this, you have varying levels of intellectual disability. Some more profound than others, really can kind of push through. Okay. Environmental causes. So why do these things happen? Environmental hazards are the second category of causes of intellectual developmental disabilities. So environmental hazards that mothers experience while pregnant. The first one is, I always say teratogens. I'm sure that other people use different pronunciation there. These are just our environmental hazards. Okay, it's the general term for environmental hazards that affect the developing child. What has the mother been exposed to, and therefore the child has been exposed to? Do know that word. Okay. Other environmental hazards are if the mother experiences rubella, which is basically like measles. If there's oxygen deprivation to the fetus during birth or while in the womb, premature birth or brain injury during delivery, and then fetal alcohol syndrome, which we are going to talk about here. So fetal alcohol syndrome is when a mother consumes alcohol during pregnancy, okay? But to be clear, it's when the mother consumes alcohol regularly and in high quantities, okay? So a mother who consumes alcohol during pregnancy increases the risk that her child will be born with fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a set of abnormalities in facial appearance, slower than average growth patterns, and nervous system delays that result in intellectual deficits. This is something that can be prevented. Okay, now again, if you know someone who has had a glass of wine while pregnant on occasion, that is not what I'm talking about here. So you do not have to run to them and give them a lecture. This is not moderate drinking, right? This is higher levels of drinking and on a regular basis. So with fetal alcohol syndrome, we see just these differences in facial appearance, growth problems, central nervous system abnormalities, and they're, related to maternal alcohol exposure. Children with fetal alcohol syndrome experience reduced brain volume and malformations to that corpus callosum. If you remember from our last lecture, that's that place in the brain that sends information back and forth from the hemispheres. Epidemiologists estimate that the prevalence is about 30 children for every 1,000 children born per year. In my opinion, that is too many for something that is preventable. All right, so let's move on to some other terminology here. And this is for treatment of intellectual developmental disorders. Now, like we said, treatment is not curing, but treatment is helping somebody function better in society. One of the things that we do is called mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is integration into ordinary school. Now, before, if you had any difficulties in any area, you were put in the special education class, and you were in there with all other kids that had all sorts of different kinds of issues. And that was a negative thing, right? Nobody was able to grow any more than where they kind of were. So mainstreaming is the idea that for all of the classes that this child is able to be in that are ordinary classes, we're going to put them in there. And for anything that that child is struggling too much with, then we're going to take them out and take them to the resource room or to get extra help with that particular topic. But then after that, they're going to go back with the regular class and integrate and be. We also call this the least restrictive environment. So that's another term. If you're in schools, you'll hear people talk about the least restrictive environment or mainstreaming. Okay. We also use a lot of behavioral interventions that involve family. One is just kind of parent training, and the other is, parent training with the child, and that is teaching them to help the child learn to use their words. If you want the applesauce, you have to say applesauce. You can't just say, okay? We guide them in a kind way. We also teach patience and how to remain calm and consistent with our behavioral training. And the last thing that I have here is friendship training. And that is that we work with people to teach them how to interact with other people their age. So, and I mean basic, like when someone walks up to you, if they look at you and say, hello, then you say, hello, right? And we practice this, and we practice it, and we practice it. We practice handshakes. We practice how to invite someone to play with you. We practice how to decide if you want to play with someone else or if you don't want to, and how to go about that. So friendship training for somebody that it just doesn't come naturally to. All right. So along with that, we're now going to talk about autism spectrum disorder, formerly known as autism. Now, autism spectrum disorder is the new term that is used for several different disorders. And that are these. So we used to, in the last DSM, we had autistic disorder, we had Asperger's disorder, we had childhood disintegrative disorder, and we had pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. They've taken all four of these disorders and now put them together in just what we call autism spectrum disorder. I still want you to know the names of these, and I want you to know the differences for our exam. And the reason is because, again, people will continue to use this terminology. But you will know, actually, it's just all called autism spectrum disorder. And a lot of times when I'm talking to people, they won't even use the word autism anymore. They just say, well, he's on the spectrum. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It involves impairments in the domains of social communication, performance of restricted and repetitive behaviors. Okay. Let's see. what do I want to do here? Okay, so I do want to talk about, hold on one second, just let me, okay. Sometimes I forget what I put in here. All right, when we are talking about autistic disorder or autism, we're talking more about the moderate to severe side of the autism spectrum disorder. We're now talking about children who have what we call stereotyped movements. I'm going to show you a video in a little bit when we talk about Rett's that will show you some stereotyped movements. They do something called stimming or stemming, which is basically movements that stimulate them, and maybe that is flapping. There's a lot of flapping that goes on. Again, these are things, if you want to, Google videos or YouTube this, you can look up stereotyped disorders, not disorders, sorry, stereotyped movements. You can look, or behaviors, you can look up stimming. You can look up simply, autism behaviors. Often also you'll see these types of children, they walk on their toes. They don't walk kind of more flat-footed like the average child. They tend to tiptoe everywhere. And not because they're being a fairy or whatever. Lots of kids tiptoe places. But this is more of an awkward walking on their toes thing. Okay, so again, people with autism, more severe autism, have a lot of trouble with language skills. They have a lot of trouble with social skills. They have a lot of trouble just integrating into normal society, right? So some of these social skills that we see is that the child doesn't usually want to be hugged or held tight. They'll usually arch away, which honestly hurts the feelings of parents. Sometimes they will lean in and they chomp down just because that's sort of a reflex. So they're not wanting to bite people, but they bite people. So these different kinds of behaviors. Now, with Asperger's is also considered a mild form of autism, okay? And that's why it's now in the autism spectrum disorder. But Asperger's is a mild form of autism if you think about it that way. Now, somebody with Asperger's does not have problems with language skills. They do not show the same kind of stemming, repetitive movements. What they do show is issues with social cues. So someone with Asperger's does not really grasp the concept of back and forth communication, and that is they may look off to the side while you talk to them. Direct eye contact is uncomfortable. They also may come off as cold or unemotional. And the truth is often they don't really understand why people want to be that way, why people want to be so close to each other and so emotional. Again, this is where those like friendship training and different types of therapy really help somebody with Asperger's function better in society. Okay. Childhood disintegrative disorder. This is basically where the child is developing as you would expect a baby to. The child learns how to do the things that a toddler learns to do. And then at some point they stop. At some point they stop and they start, either they just stop where they are, or they start to decline in abilities that they previously gained. I always find this one to be kind of scary because you kind of think everything's going along well and then it's just not. And again, now we kind of put this in with the autism spectrum disorders. And the last one here is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. It was basically when you had a child who was exhibiting different things, but they didn't quite meet criteria for autistic disorder or childhood disintegrative disorder or Asperger's disorder. But you knew something was going on. And so now again, we kind of clump it all together in our autism spectrum disorder. And we know that it is a wide spectrum. So children are evaluated along two different domains, and that is social and communication disturbances. And then also we notice a restricted range of interests and performance of repetitive behaviors and activities. So let's say a child is interested in trains, right? Lots of little boys are interested in trains. They like Thomas the Train, choo-choo, yay, right? Now, a child with autism is going to be interested in only trains and knowing every single thing about trains. And when all the other children and boys move on to fire trucks and superheroes, they stay on trains. And they stay on trains maybe their entire lives. Now, it can, of course, be a different topic. It doesn't have to be trains, although it's often trains. We see that restricted, repetitive behaviors and activities. Okay? Within each domain, the clinician specifies one of three severity levels. We say that that child is requiring support, is requiring substantial support, or is requiring very substantial support, meaning this child will probably never be able to live on their own. Okay. Children with autism spectrum disorder may show developmental deficits in communication and social patterns and behavior. The friendship patterns of these children are unique because they don't seem to enjoy playing with others. They don't seem to enjoy sharing experiences more than the average person, and they don't engage in typical social interactions. You'll see children with autism spectrum disorder doing what we call parallel play. Parallel play is when two kids play in the same space and maybe even with the same toys, but they are not playing together. Right? They're not playing like, oh, we're playing house and you're the mommy and you're the baby and you're the dog. They are just playing trucks near someone else who is playing trucks. Okay? Another piece of autism spectrum disorder, a behavior that I find interesting, and again, this is something you can look up, is echolalia. You should be able to recognize part of that word, which is echo. Echolalia is, when we have a normal conversation, I say, hey, how are you? And you say, oh, I'm good. How are you? A person with this behavior, I would say, hey, how are you? And they would say, hey, how are you? They wouldn't answer the question. They would just simply repeat what I said. And if I said, well, I'm doing well, they would say, well, I'm doing well. They would just simply echo either words that we say, or they echo, if you think about it that way, behaviors that somebody else did, or they just repeat their own behaviors. Okay. Individuals with autism spectrum disorder may also develop extremely narrow, specifically focused interests. So that's what I mentioned before. Now, something that goes along with that is the autistic savant. Okay, now you may have heard this referred to as an idiot savant in the past. Not the nicest term. So autistic savant, this is someone who has the deficits of a person with autism spectrum disorder. However, they extremely excel at something else. So maybe they excel at the piano and they are a savant when it comes to the piano, or they're savant when it comes to physics or math or poetry. It's amazing. But an individual that has so many deficits can focus on one thing and be incredible at it. Now, not everyone with autism spectrum disorder has the savant piece, but when they do, that's what we call it, autistic savant. Okay. According to the CDC, prevalence rates are increasing. In 2007, the CDC estimated the prevalence rates in the US were approximately 1 of every 150 children. In 2012, the rates increased to 1 in 68. Part of the issue in estimating prevalence is that standards for diagnosis vary considerably across studies, okay? As do the sources of information used for establishing a diagnosis. So while we see that it looks like this is increasing, we don't actually know that. Also, as more people are aware that this is a disorder and that this is a problem, they're bringing their children in and getting diagnosed, as to where before they did not. And again, as we call this autism spectrum disorder, more children who before would have just been called, well, she's a little quiet, or she's kind of shy, or, she's a little odd, she's a little quirky, are now all considered having autism spectrum disorder. So it's difficult to say, is there actually an increase, or is there a change in how many people are being diagnosed with this? Okay. Also, I want to be very, very clear about this. Vaccines do not cause autism. Vaccines have never caused autism. Unfortunately, there was a person who put out a study that said that vaccines might have been causing autism. That person has lost their license. They have been taken out of being able to do research ever again because this person came out and said, yes, I fabricated or made up this data. It was not real. It was never real. Unfortunately, certain celebrities got a hold of this information and wrote a book and went on a media tour scaring people into believing that vaccines cause autism. Now, that particular celebrity's child is actually has improved. So that child most likely never had autism in the first place also. Anyway, point being, that was very unfortunate. Very unfortunate that that happened because it is important for children to have vaccines. Children getting these diseases, polio, measles, mumps, that is dangerous. You are not at a higher risk of developing autism from vaccines. Okay. That won't be on your exam, just an FYI. All right, theories of autism spectrum disorder, evidence pointing to patterns of familial inheritance supports the theory that autism spectrum disorder is biologically caused, either due to chromosomal abnormalities, structural brain abnormalities, or functional brain abnormalities. Treatments. We have the Lovaas treatment. We have self-control procedures. We teach people to improve their language and communication during the child's early years. We teach adaptive skills, and we teach interaction of peers, or we teach with interaction of peers rather than adults. Okay. One of the things I really like at these centers that do a lot of treatment for children with autism is they have these like padded wheel things that you put that a child basically goes through the two of them and it smushes them. And there's something about pressure and while being smushed that children with autism really find calming and enjoy. And I love that they have figured that out. And I love that they're really thinking about the children and not just about how to make them easier on parents, but really what is best for these kids. Rett syndrome is the last thing I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to do this lecture in 2 parts. So this is the last thing we're going to do before I take a break. Now, with Rett syndrome, we see this only in females, exclusively in females. Normal development occurs in this child early in life, up to age 4. Usually we see the decline start before 4. And then neurological and cognitive impairments develop. There's a deceleration of head growth. Some of the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder are there. The syndrome occurs, like I said, exclusively in females and can be used as a specifier for autism spectrum disorder. So it's not actually a separate diagnosis. Rett syndrome is something we talk about, but it's not technically a DSM diagnosis. We can say autism spectrum disorder, specifically Rett syndrome. Okay. I'm going to go to a little video here. Where's my video? There it is. And that is of Rett's disorder here. Now, this is an older video, but I happen to still like it the best. I'm going to show you stereotyped movements. Watch the girl's hands. So you don't have to listen to what they're saying. Where is she?
If she's 15 years old.
Sorry, let me scroll on through here. Yeah. So if we watch this little girl, again, you don't need to listen to what they're talking about, but just notice her. She's not paying attention, or not paying attention, but she's not focused. And there, do you see that particular hand? Some people call it like a hand washing stereotyped movement.
When I heard about his work, I had unbelievable joy.
Now there's tangible proof for the first time.
There's another one that they go to another child that you'll see, which I also find a good there. So you see that same thing here with this girl, is that stereotyped movement. They do it over and over and over and over and over again. There's something neurologically happening that makes all of these girls do this same interesting motion. If you take a child this age and you give them stuffed animals, there's usually some interest. There's usually something. But if you see this sort of adaptive training that they're doing here, they're training her to do things that other kids would do. We pet the little bear. We pet the deer. Okay, so you get the point there. Go ahead and stop that. Okay. Where did my PowerPoint go? Okay, so that is that. So we're going to take a break here, and we'll come back in a second part of this lecture. I'll see you in a bit.